Matt, morning to you. It's great of you to join us this morning. Just very quickly for the people who will be watching this, Matt Andrews is a senior lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, South African originally, cut his teeth in the provincial government in KwaZulu-Natal and at the World Bank. Along with your work in public finance management and so on, Matt, I think what's interested us particularly is your interest in the non-technical and informal sides of institutional reform and what makes for success. And that's, I think, a very relevant issue in our context. So perhaps that's a good entry point, really, is to ask you in very simple language, really, what is this thing called capacity or capability? What does it look like?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I think implementation gets a bad rap because I think we often kind of develop these grand strategies and then they don't happen. We kind of blame the implementers. We aren't necessarily thinking about it in a constructive way. And just to make it clear, the blame game is very, very important to think about here because it's present in all public policy realms. And it's a blame game that involves politicians blaming designers, designers blaming implementers, implementers blaming the designers, and citizens essentially just getting the raw deal at the end of the day. So the capabilities we're looking for are systemic capabilities that have a lot to do with the relationships between these different groups that I'm talking about, that essentially allow the system to identify problems, firstly, and then to work their way towards solutions that actually solve the problems. Now, that sounds like a kind of a fuzzy type of definition, but that is my definition of capability. When a system can do that, then it has the capability to do that. You know, my PhD advisor, he said, the hardest thing about kind of identifying capacity or capability is that you know when it's there and you know when it's not there, but we can't really define what it is outside of that. And unfortunately, that's the reality. And when I look at South Africa, here's the tough thing. It's not there. It's not there, and there's not one party to blame for it. The system can't get its act together. And part of, as I've explained, the reason for that is that actors in the system have narratives about themselves that suggest that they're doing fine and that are frustrating the development of that capability over the long run.
Matt, I mean, that was really interesting. But you were, if I understand you correctly, I mean, you're talking about systems, but you're talking about them as living things in a way. They're interactive living things. They're not static institutional systems. They're living, breathing ecosystems, perhaps, in a way. Um, and we talk a lot here, and the president talks a lot about social compacting, right? And this notion that we've got to get all the parties together, and we've got to collaborate, and we've got to share, and so on. So some of that language of collaborative action and jointly understanding problems and jointly developing approaches is there rhetorically, at least. But as you say, we don't get to it. So I guess the two questions that leads to, in my mind anyway, are why? What stands in the way? And given that this has been our experience for so long, what do you do to change the narrative? What do you do to change the dynamic?
If I look back over 30 years in South Africa, I was involved in the 1990s, and I think everyone actually looked at South Africa and said, wow, you guys have NEDLAC, you guys have all these forums, people talk to each other. When we got into gear, the theory was, hey, let's control our public finances, let's kind of discipline our deficits, etc. Did we do it? We did do it, right? When we got into Asgisa, we said, oh, we need a public works program. So did we develop it? Yes. Did it hire people? Yes. Here is the frustrating thing with policy is we actually don't fail, we successfully fail. What do I mean? We deliver a lot of short-run products again and again and again and again and again, but we don't put them together or we don't, deliver the impact that is needed over the long run. Right? Developing a welfare program is an intermediate outcome. It's not the impact that you want. You want the welfare program so that essentially people have a safety net that when they're in tough times helps them through the tough time, but also helps them out of the tough time really fast, right? That's the impact we want, and that's not where we are, right? So if you get that wrong and you sit with the intermediate outcome, it's not the welfare program that's the problem. It's the fact that now you have a welfare program that just looks after people who are perpetually in bad times, right? And that's not what we want, but that's where we're stuck, which is what I think characterizes where we are. And the positive side of it is that the narrative isn't that government fails, right? The narrative is that government succeeds in the things that it commits to do. And what we need to do then is we need to get into those relational mechanisms, those softer parts of the process, and we need to get everyone in the process to be more courageous, right? About saying, I'm going to actually carry that can. And it needs to be everyone together, which is why I speak about multi-agent leadership and people working together, and why I like working in teams, where the teams bring politicians, designers, and implementers together. We need to open the space where we develop new mechanisms and processes, right, that allow us to deal with these harder to work with issues.
Maybe just sort of on that, I mean, Matt, I mean, and I think you're absolutely right, but kind of where we are as government, we're progressively moving towards like performance-based budgeting. And, so you've got these so it's not just about, achieving and blame, but it's really about failing to perform. And now you have an auditor general who actually almost like raps you over the knuckles if you haven't performed, and then you get your budget zapped away as well. Some of your thoughts around that and recommendations on how to remedy it or where it has been remedied in other parts of the world.
A lot of the work in implementation is done by independent contractors. Here's the problem with performance-based contracting. The idea is spectacular. The idea is we're going to determine what our goals are going to be, and then we're going to tie you to our goals. The results chain is kind of like this linear flat thing. I like to think more about a hierarchy of goals. At the top of it, we like to say, hey, we need to create jobs. We need to get rid of unemployment. Now that's at the top, right? That's the goal, and that's where we kind of develop those metrics. Then when we get into the planning processes, whether it's be about annual budgets or about project-based work, and many of us do project-based work through policies, we say, okay, but how do we get there? And then we use tools like a logical framework or like a theory of change. I am sure that everyone listening uses these tools. What they have us do is they have us reduce that high-level challenge into lower-level performance objectives, right? So before we get there, what would the long-term outcomes look like? Before we get there, what would the intermediate outcomes? I'm using language people know. Before we get there, what are the outputs? Before we get there, what are the activities? And then we get to what is the resourcing requirement, right? The time horizon is usually, in a planning sense, between 1 year and 4 years, 1 year and 5 years. Okay, this is based on my research. 1 year, 4 years, 5 years. It's going to be driven by annual budget processes and by political cycles. So then you say to the people, well, what can we deliver in 4 years or 5 years? And you say, well, we definitely can't deliver that thing at the front, at the top, right? That next level of cascaded things, now and again we can, and that's only when we really, really are disciplined in building on past work, which we're very bad at doing, okay? So we end up reducing ourselves down to the performance objectives being the ones at lower levels. Then we structure performance agreements around those things. So what we need to be thinking about is not so much that these are bad ideas, but that the manifestation of performance contracting has become a pernicious problem for us. It is slowly keeping us from getting to the top of that hierarchy. It keeps us away from the unknown and uncertain and difficult to attribute combinations of outputs and activities into outcomes and into impacts. And because we act on them, this is actually kind of the thing that I think is almost the saddest part is the countries that do the best on these, where they say we have performance contracts and we actually enforce them, they're the ones who have the biggest problem. Now, so it's not that they're a bad idea, and we want people to be accountable, right? The question is, how do we create mechanisms that make our systems accountable? And how do we create mechanisms that make them accountable over the long run, not just the short run? So this is really something that we need to think a lot harder about. It's in when I was saying, what are the three problems? We have these complex challenges, then we have these processes that don't allow us to get to them. That's in that second bucket of one of those processes, but it also falls prey to kind of this risk avoidance of people, right? So, I imagine people in the room, the idea of saying, let's develop a performance metrics, really say to you, actually, let's not have an annual metric. Let's hold the whole department responsible for whether or not you create the 500,000 jobs in 3 years' time. And let's agree that we will all lose our jobs if we don't create the 500,000 jobs. Everyone in the room right now is saying, I'm not going to ascribe to that until South Africa becomes a nation where people do ascribe to that. We're going to have unemployment growing continually. The countries that did get out of it didn't have those kinds of performance contracts. If you look at the countries, people like to talk about East Asia, Singapore, etc., and they think, well, they just had smart people. They had brave people. They had people who said, we're not here to build a road. We're here to ensure that a road gets built so that we get more business. And the goal is more business. And if we don't achieve more business and there aren't more jobs, we've all failed. And that was their performance metric. And it wasn't written down. It was just part of the norm. It was in the water.
Matt, can I pick up on that? Because where has that conversation succeeded? I mean, you alluded to one or two examples, right? It might be just really useful to say, to talk a little bit about where people, where societies, where cultures have been able to keep their eye on the real ball. And are there obviously, are there examples in the developing and African kind of context as well that we could learn from?
Firstly, I would say which places would I look at, are places that I look at over the long run, that they achieve those impacts with the kind of systems that allow it to be sustained. So I would say, looking in real time, Africa becomes then a hard place to describe, because I don't think any of us would really look at Africa and say that they're places that have got there. So most places are en route, right? Rwanda is very interesting for me, because I think Rwanda, you have had this kind of, let's look at the top of that pyramid and let's go for that. Public health, Rwanda, they've achieved a lot in terms of that. In terms of economic growth, I think Rwanda has said, let's not put our eggs in one basket, let's put them in every basket, right? So basically they're saying, we're going to go after IT, we're going to go after light and heavy manufacturing, we're going to go after flowers, we're going to go after local agriculture, we're going to make our people happier, we're going to go after tourism. It's not saying we're going to do everything poorly, it's saying we're going to do 10 things and we're going to do them really well. And we're going to really, really try. The political settlement thing in Rwanda is something that I think is still a gigantic question mark. And even jobs and industrial development, I think it's too early, given my experience, to tell, because there's a lot of countries that have gotten where Rwanda have gotten where it hasn't taken, right? But I do think that anybody who's worked in Rwanda would say to you, there's a different attitude, there's a different perspective, and the people in the process are I think much more focused on those long run things than on just the short run things. The only one that I would put in the category in Africa is maybe Mauritius, right? Where I would say that over an extensive period of time now, we've seen Mauritius developing, really creating jobs, creating health systems that work, and we've seen them creating kind of political settlements that seem to be sticking together. And it's a fairly complex place. People would say, so small, but can it be so complex? It's not a homogenous place, right? So it's a difficult place to lead and to manage. Where I think they've moved to, and why I would include them as kind of a success story, is because it's not just kind of the initial bets that they made that have paid off. It's not just, hey, we have a financial sector, we have tourism, we have a clothing sector, etc. What you start to see is now dynamics around those things where they're creating new successes that were surprising. They didn't come out of grand strategies. When your society starts to become its own creative mechanism, that's when you're hitting success. So you can see, for instance, that they invested a lot in their health system. and they invested in training doctors, etc. And now they've got a really interesting, interaction, and I'm interested in this, between what's going on in the health sector, where they have these skilled doctors, and tourism, and now they have this thing called, health tourism, right? Well, they didn't imagine that. That came about at the confluence of two rivers, which tells me that those rivers are learning how to connect and engage and co-produce. Mandela, what did he used to say? He used to say, it's only impossible until you've done it. The difficult thing is that you need to invade and inhabit different spaces to do the impossible. Once you've inhabited them once, then you say, why didn't I do this before? So how do you do it is your question, Glenn. And, I would say, part of our approach with something called PDIA is that's a process to do this, right? PDIA is not just about kind of achieving things. PDIA is essentially, we say, first, let's start with the problem, which is the thing at the top. And let's be driven by the problem. Let's constantly keep our eye on the problem. Let's be hungry and aggressive and angry at ourselves for the fact that that problem has not been solved, right? That drives us every day, every second. Let us not reduce our focus to the small things that we do. But then, let's iterate in the small, because that's what we can do. But let's iterate really quickly in the small. So let's identify small things, right? And let's not do them as the product, but let's do them as the things that we learn through for the adaptation. Problem-driven, iterative adaptation. And key principle of this is you do it together. You learn as a system.
It almost sounds like the actions actually come from the bottom up. But I mean, how important is it about leadership and looking at, and you talk about multi-agency leadership, but I mean, how important is that leadership and how it is instrumental in trying to infuse sort of more creative, adaptive, innovative solutioning, problem solving in the public sector?
Gigantically important. Most people who are presidents, heads of organizations, they are authorizers and they exercise authority, and that is a good thing. The president of the country is there to uphold the constitution of the country. The president of the country is there to manage departments and agencies and a cabinet that does stuff. Most of that is making sure they're in compliance with the budget law. Most of that is that, right? Most of their job. That's an authorizer. We're not asking them to do anything risky. We're asking them to just comply with the law or to exercise compliance. Leadership is saying to them, all of these people only do what you allow them to do. All of these people are scared of being blamed if things fail. All of these people at the moment are only working on those lower level things and stopping. What we need you to do is create a space where you say to them, not only do I want you to go beyond that, but I am going to be the one who creates the space and uses my authority to give you that space. So I'm actually going to create a vehicle for you, and I'm going to say they will blame me. That is leadership, because you're using your authority in a risky way. And we define this leadership as taking risks on behalf of things you care about. And so what we're looking for oftentimes is what we call authorizers with an itch. Whether they are political authorizers or administrative authorizers, we're looking for the people who say, I'm tired of not solving unemployment. So what we'll do is we'll say, let's try and get as many of those conversations happening where people are saying, I'm tired, and let's build a coalition. When we speak about multi-agent leadership, the first definition of leadership is taking risks on behalf of things you care about, right? The second one, when you're talking about authorizers, is disappointing your followers at a rate that they can absorb, okay? Which means take that risk carefully. Don't put the heat up too much, whether they are the people who vote for you or the people who work for you, right? The third one is mobilize people to take the risk with you.
Matt, thank you very much for your time and for your insights and wisdom. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour with you. We've actually learned quite a lot. I'm sure Glenn has. I'm speaking for myself. Thank you very much and stay safe.